All right, so I think it's time now for us to get started. I hope I'm audible to everybody. Maybe you could give me a thumbs up, Clark. Maybe I can see you. Perfect. All right. So, a very warm welcome to everyone joining us for this session today from across the globe, as usual. My name is Isha, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. Some quick housekeeping announcements before we get into the actual discussion. All attendees are going to be on mute by default. If you have any questions, please raise your hand, type them in the chat window, or post them in the Q&A panel. Please also note that the webinar is being recorded and the recording would be made available to everybody who is registered in a few days from now. Also, you'll get a survey link right after the webinar to share your feedback on the session. We'd really appreciate if you could take a few moments to fill up that survey and let us know your thoughts on the session and if we could improve anything for the next time. And with that, it's time for me to introduce our fabulous speaker duo for today, which you can already see on your screens, but I'll make some quick introductions first. So we have Sonal Sheth, the Chief Operating Officer of Upside Learning. So with over 18 years of experience in the e-learning industry, Sonal heads the content services team of 100 plus e-learning specialists at Upside Learning. She is the one responsible for the successful execution of all our projects and solutions delivered by the team. She builds on her early experience of working in different domains, including graphic design, instructional design, and project management to innovate and create better and impactful learning solutions. Welcome, Sonal. And Sonal is being joined by none other than the e-learning maestro himself, the way I like to call him, Clark Quinn. Clark is Upside Learning's chief learning strategist. He's been involved in the design, development, and evaluation of a wide variety of educational technology for over 40 years. Clark has authored multiple books on learning, and he also holds the honor of being awarded as eLearning Guild's first Guild Master in 2012. And now, without any further ado, Clark, I'll invite you to take over.
Thank you very much, Isha, for that gracious introduction, and welcome everybody. Glad to have you here with us today, talking about impact. And to start, I want to ask the question of you, what is impact? What do you think is impact? And you can type your answer into the chat if you would be so kind. But when we're talking about wanting to have impact, what are we looking for? What does that mean to you? What is it you're looking to have as an outcome of your efforts? Timely moving forward. Okay, the outcome of the intervention implemented. Yes, you want an outcome. Positive changes. Yeah, indeed. Change in behavior due to the training. Yeah, you'd really like to actually lead to something different happening. Effective outcomes, right? Change, lasting effects, less student stress. That might be an outcome as well, Jennifer. Change in behavior positively, yes. Measurable change in the right direction, Amit. No sneaky answer there. And Lavette says, impactful results, new difference enhanced on the job performance that is observable and measurable. So you really are picking up on the important elements, I think. What I suggest is that impact is, as was suggested by several different comments there, a shift in behavior. And specifically, when there's a particular way we've been responding to a situation, or there are new situations we're anticipating, we'd like to make sure that we have an appropriate response. So instead of necessarily climbing out, if it's a small fire, knowing how to use a fire extinguisher to put it out would be a concrete example, right? So we want to have a change in behavior. Now, they could be negative or positive changes. You could make people worse at doing something. So as was suggested in the chat, we're looking for positive changes. And that can be improvements in any way. That can be positive increases in things we want to go up, increases in sales, turnaround time for deliveries, increased scores on customer evaluation or government outcomes or evaluating bodies. Can also be decreases in things that are positive. So decreases in things we want to go down, decreases in quality issues, a reduction in bugs in code if we're creating that, fewer customer escalations of problems to higher levels. These are all things we would like to go down. We'll revisit that. But what that implies, by the way, is we need to identify a specific needed change. We need to identify, be very clear, what is it we need to impact? What is it that needs to change to create that impact? And quantitatively. Qualitatively is okay, but we want to even quantify the qualitative responses. We really want to know that we've changed it in a measurable way. And as Levette says, yes, measurable, observable positive results. In fact, observable is one of my heuristics for doing evaluation. Well, first, for defining an performance objective should lead to an observable change in behavior. So that's really important that we're upfront looking in and finding out what is the root cause. Well, first we want to know the performance gap. What isn't at the level it should be? We should have a very clear definition of what this should be and what it is now, and that there's a delta. And then we want to identify the root cause, because there are times when what is causing that gap isn't something that training is going to affect, or e-learning, or even a job aid. Sometimes, in fact, many times, a job aid may be a better solution than e-learning or training, but you won't know that until you go in and identify the root cause of the performance gap. It might also be the case that they could do what you need them to do, they just aren't for other reasons. That may not be an opportunity training or e-learning can affect. So you really need to do this analysis to make sure you're applying the right solution, identifying the right problem and applying the right solution to the problem. Now, a familiar framework gives us different levels of impact. The ideal is indeed moving a metric in an organization, but sometimes we're not ready for that yet. So we might just be talking about better ratings of our learning interventions. Some people don't even do that, but at the end, you could ask people what they thought of it. There's a problem. People's actual evaluation of the impact of learning experience and its real impact is low, particularly for novices. It's about 0. But we may eventually care, particularly if we're impacting any of these higher level things, like increasing the scores of people after any learning intervention on an assessment of their ability to perform. Next level up is actually looking at their behavior change persisting into the workplace. So not only are we demonstrating that they can do it differently, but they're continuing to do it differently in the workplace. And at the top level, seeing if that actually has any impact on the organizational performance metric that we might start with. That's the ideal, but wherever you are in this, we'll talk about making the next step. So at this point, it's time for a poll. And Isha, I'm going to stop sharing and ask you to put up the poll.
So I've launched the poll. I hope everybody can see it on their screens.
Yeah.
Clark and Sonal, you cannot participate.
Oh, man. Come on, we want to skew the results.
I'll give it a couple of seconds more.
Mm-hmm. What we're seeing, we're getting 70% so far have participated. And
so I may just close the poll in about 3, 2, 1 seconds.
Oh,
All right.
okay. So if you look at the results,
Yes.
you'll see that this is interesting, actually. Many years ago, when I wrote my book on revolutionizing learning and development, ATD had data about how people responded to this question. And about most people, 80% or something, were doing level 1, which is asking what they thought. That they started before just checking to see if they show up. But it dropped substantially. Only a third were doing level 2, an eighth were doing level 3, and almost zero were doing what we have as number 4 here. This is a much better representation. We're getting a lot of people actually testing, at least at the end, for ability. There is a drop off, but 16% are looking at org impact. That's good. So we have changed over arguably the last decade or so, maybe a bit more, to becoming aware that this is good. And so this is a step in the right direction, and definitely something we want to see. So if we're fine with that, we're going to stop the sharing the results of the poll, and Sonal is going to help us make concrete some of those ideas.
Thank you, Clark. Hello, everyone. Lovely to spend this morning, evening with all of you. I do have a few case studies which are somewhere in sync with, what Clark did just mention, which is about measuring, the outcomes at different levels. I'll bring up the first one. Just a minute, I see the poll screen, which we did for one of a large multinational bank on a very interesting topic, which was about building cultural affinity. Now, when it comes to banking and customer relationships, employee qualities such as honesty, integrity, and focus on customer service all create a trusting and supportive environment, making the bank's commitment to future goals even stronger. We were approached by this bank to design a solution that can enable their employees to apply those values in their work life, demonstrating a strong corporate culture. We started with the CEO's video where he established, how the bank culture impacts the way they work and their growth overall. We worked closely with their teams to build scenarios that were meant to represent the complex situations which employees faced in their daily work. This gave them a safe space to explore and embody the company's values through decision making. The program did achieve a remarkable rating of 4.8 out of 5, establishing a new standard for organizations' learning initiative. It bagged some global recognitions to in form of awards. So this was the first one, which is also in sync with, liking setting up a new benchmark in the space of learning. The next case study, which I have for you, is from a large tech company who had approached us with a very clear objective, and that was to train their sales rep sell better. Now, for any sales director, the key focus is to increase sales. And when there is an exclusive free offering at hand that can substantially boost conversions, one would aim for more sales. For this particular organization, the challenge was that the sales staff were not able to leverage the free offering meaningfully. Our team worked very closely with them to craft interactive demos that presented decision points at critical moments in the conversation. Not only did that encourage sales staff to reflect on the offering more deeply, but it also provided important conversation clues. The guided simulated real-life customer interactions, highlighting how the offering could address various pain points that customer could be facing. So it was a blend of a little bit of show me, a little bit of practice, and this training intervention was a big success. You'll see two numbers on the screen. One is 4.49 out of 5 and other is 92. I'll just explain what that means. So the number or the rating of 4.49 out of 5 was from learners. And in this context, it meant that it instilled a great deal of confidence in them. They found the information relevant and also something they could apply on the job. Now, consuming the training was the first step. And, once the sales rep consumed the training, they were supposed to pass an accreditation program. 92%, which you see on the screen, is the total score, which represents that, whosoever consumed the training, 92% of them completed it successfully and they cleared the accreditation program, which later impacted the sales positively. This was a clear case of increased retention and in turn increased ability to apply the knowledge on the job. The third case study, it's around destigmatizing mental health. Now, mental health is an important and equally sensitive topic for many organizations. However, it's not easy to destigmatize it. There are many who suffer but don't speak up. And same was the case with one of the global airline company who observed few people asking for help on time. In fact, they even had a dedicated helpline which was not utilized very well. Our aim was to destigmatize this topic, and the best way we could think was to build an emotional connect with our audience. So, in collaboration with our team, we were able to roll out a very relatable, story driven digital learning experience. It featured personas with diverse mental health stories, aiming to mirror employees' own experiences for better engagement and early issue recognition. The program combined interactive scenarios for self reflection with advice from mental health professionals, breaking down stigmas which made mental health topics more approachable and understandable. Over the time, this initiative significantly increased the number of employees seeking help early. In fact, it tripled. The learning intervention also played an important role in enhancing the airline's reputation as a supportive employer, and it also established a new standard for corporate mental health initiative. I personally feel this really helped influence the behavior. These are the three case studies I have for today. Over to you, Clark.
Thanks, Sonal. I greatly appreciate that. And I will start sharing my screen again to ask you this question. So Sonal shared some examples across that. At the level one, just getting a better rating. At another level, a client was looking to actually demonstrate that they had mastered the ability. And in a third instance, they were actually looking to impact significant metrics for the organization. That's great. Why is this important? Why do we care? What matters about all this? Because why we have interventions, why do we care about having impact of our interventions? And I realize this is kind of a seemingly obvious question, but it's actually, when you look at the number of people who aren't going, and not necessarily the audience here, but in general in the industry, there are too many people who develop training and deliver it, and they believe their job is done. That's it. We build it. It is good. Is that okay? Or do we actually need to know why impact, why we should be striving for it? And again, this is a question to you all to pop into the chat. As I'm awaiting responses, in the meantime, I'll respond. I'm going to possibly mispronounce this. Gayatri was mentioning that, looking for transfer to the workplace or actually having an impact requires a seat at the leadership table. It can, but it can also just be partnerships with the business unit. Anybody who has that data and is looking to impact and will work with you doesn't necessarily require the top levels of the organization. It merely requires breaking out of the silo and working with people and using their data and talking to their people and validating that it is leading to persistence. So there's some requirement of breaking out of the L&D silo. It doesn't necessarily. So why is impact? It is your bottom line. It is what you're doing, is what you are doing, getting the behaviors of performance required. Yes. In most projects, we engage only develop a hand of not retained to assess learner effectiveness. Yeah, that's a challenge, Gayatri. And I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. But what Leslie's arguing, that it is indeed, I think it's going to happen that your CFO is eventually going to wake up and go, what is the impact of our training budget? It's largely been a matter of faith, but in an increasingly era of tightening budgets and looking for impact, eventually they're going to come to you and say, and I would like us to be ahead of the game. So I want to suggest, ROI is critical. Yes, and I do believe that it's not just, the impact on the metric, but the cost to achieve that impact. Although there may be interventions that may have slightly not as good an ROI, but are going to have a much bigger impact on the organization. So I wouldn't necessarily stop with ROI, but I certainly would include it in the picture. So the real reason to me is to stop wasting training dollars. Right now, there was an estimate, and unfortunately they didn't back it up with any links, but there is evidence that our investments in training, only 10% or 15% of it actually have an impact on the organization. That means 85 to 90% of our investment is potentially wasted. We don't know if we're not evaluating whether it's having an impact. We should be doing, and this came from a talk about the fundamentals of finance. There's two major impacts our intervention should have at the end of the day. It's not that each intervention is going to directly impact us, but by indirectly, it's each part of the picture of increasing revenue or decreasing costs. Those are the two things that affect businesses' success. And what we want to do is make sure that when we are spending resources to have interventions, we want to make sure that we're not just throwing that away, and we will not know if we're not actually checking, designing for impact, and evaluating to see if we have impact. I will get to that question, Gayatri. Well, more to Gen AI for expediting production efforts and to enhance learner experience. Gen AI generally can be a tool we use with scrutiny, by the way. It can make mistakes. It shouldn't be trusted completely, but Gen AI can help us increase the learner experience, but it won't necessarily increase our impact. We can use it with very careful, this is a much greater picture, use it to evaluate responses, which can collect data we can use to evaluate to demonstrate the impact. We can see if people are able to perform better in soft skills situations like dealing with customers. We can train them and see if and evaluate whether they're doing it, and then look to see if it's impacting. But Gen AI by itself won't necessarily solve that problem. We still need to have the core metrics coming in from the organization at the end of the day. Right. So we want impact. We know what it is. We want it. How do we get it? What does it take to achieve impact? So, somebody comes with us with a request for a course, and we design a course based upon their requests and the PDFs and PowerPoints they give it, and that achieves impact, right? Or maybe not. What does it take to achieve impact? I've suggested a wee bit of it along the way. Levette says, as a cost center, so connecting the dots to learning investment is community, the bottom line becomes what we must solve for. Well, we do want to make that connection between our interventions and the outcomes. And to be fair, in organizations, there may be multiple efforts to address something. So they may be changing the incentives at the same time they're applying training. If they want to introduce a new sales process, ideally they will. There's stories from the past about they train people to do solution selling, to move away from product selling to solution selling. This was some decades in the past. I'm not sure what the latest selling phenomena model is. But then after the training, they found out that people were still doing product selling, and they went back and looked, and of course, they hadn't changed the incentives. So they're still rewarding product selling, even though they were telling people to do solution selling. Which do you think they're going to do? The one that gives them commission. So you need to make sure these are aligned. And at times, companies can do multiple things. How do you assess the impact of your training intervention? Well, as Livette is suggesting, we have to find that path. And that's what Kirkpatrick intended is designed to be. The main thing he even once admitted in a phone call I was on was that he probably numbered it wrong. Level 4 is where you're supposed to start, not where you're supposed to end. And Phillips has added ROI, has been suggested in the discussion as well. But how do we get impact? What is your thought? What are your thoughts on what it takes to get impact? I suggest that there are 3 major steps, but I'm giving away the punchline, so I won't go any further. You know, it's hard to pull chat comments out of people in a short period of time. They want to compose and get their thoughts down, which is why I've been nattering on. Stakeholder buy-in. That actually is an important component, Livette. Having your stakeholders believe in what you're doing and giving you the freedom, because one of the things that has come out in the chats and in our experience is that to get impact, you have to work with people who are willing to let you do the necessary upfront determinations and then be willing to share with you the data you need to check to see if you're doing it well and to then determine the outcome. Ruthlessly relevant training. I like that. Tree J says, understanding skills of performance that mean developed and measured. Yeah, you have to know what you're aiming for. Student engaged or wanting to be engaged. Helping them understand why they should care about it is a big, important. Demonstrate L&D is working, Cindy. Yeah, that is the outcome of what achieving impact is. It will demonstrate L&D is working through the design, facilitation, coaching, and evaluation of all. Yeah. Daniti says, having interventions based on expected performance outcomes that directly influence business goals and having measures in place to evaluate potential changes in performance. Yes, we want to really align things. And if we've done that analysis up front, then we need good design to help us deliver the impact we've identified. So we want good design. And that was suggested in a couple of responses. From a learning science point of view, there's a couple key targets for what we're doing. And the first is to improve retention over time. Because what that means, by the way, is that from our interventions in learning, when it's time for learners to face that situation out in the performance environment, they need to still have remembered it. If it's gone away, if they've forgotten it by the time they have to face it, it hasn't done us any good. So we have to make sure they have retained that information from the learning event till the time it's needed. In some instances, boom, they're doing it a lot right after the learning environment. Boom, we don't really have that problem except to make sure they're doing it right and do the corrections as it goes. But other times it may be something that only happens every so often. And then we really need to ensure that we've got the retention we need or find another way, like put the information in the world instead of trying to put it in the head. And then we wanted, the other goal is transfer to all appropriate situations and no inappropriate ones. We want people, if we've been trained, to use it where it should be used. And that's not something we should take for granted. We should not expect that if we train on something, and we'll unpack this a little bit more in a moment, but we need to make sure that we are creating a transferable ability to do it, not just that it's retained, but that it's also transferring to all appropriate situations. So really, most situations people face, they're in a context and something triggers the requirement to make a decision. An editorial soapbox, I will suggest that what's going to make a difference to your organization going forward is not the ability to recite rote facts. It's going to be the ability to make particular decisions that people aren't making or aren't making right in the current situation. So, and we have evidence from learning science as well that learning in context transfers better than learning in the abstract. And why we give kids abstract math problems escapes me, because that's not how they develop an ability to apply that in the real world, and we see evidence of that. So a good learning experience, what you practice is what you perform. And so we should make sure that our practices are having people doing the same type of performance they need to do in the real world, so that we put them in a setting, we give them a context, we have a situation that precipitates the requirement to make a decision, and then we have alternatives for their responses. There is a correct answer and consequences of that, and wrong answers. Mind you, the wrong answers should not be random or silly. They should represent reliable misconceptions. They should represent ways people go wrong. Why? Because we have a chance to remedy it in the learning experience so they don't get it wrong in the performance environment. And we do observe that most mistakes people make are patterned, are reliable misconceptions. We make a little bit of randomness in our architecture, but that's not the way to bet. The thing to do is to find the alternative ways people go wrong and bake those in. If they don't go wrong on it, there's little reason to practice it. They'll get it right. But if they will get it wrong, figure out why and make that an alternative and trap it in the learning experience so you have a chance to address it. And that's show the consequences of their choices first, and then give them the outside feedback. Now, that's just a better written multiple choice question. But they can, many times these decisions travel in packs. If you make the right answer, it goes, in a conversation with the client, first you have to remove, if you have an upset customer, first you have to reduce the emotional level if they're upset down to a level where they're willing to hear you work them through the solution. First you have to talk them down. Then you need to start going in and diagnosing the solution. So that can be a branching scenario, that can be a full simulation-driven experience, but there are times when these go through. If nothing else, please write better multiple choice questions, but consider the value of scenarios. Practice needs to be contextualized, as I already suggested, and well-crafted scenarios help. Really, mentored live performance is the best practice. Only two problems with that. Individual mentoring doesn't scale well. And if they get it wrong in performance, it's costly. The next best thing are scenarios. So putting people in scenarios and asking them to perform is the best practice we can have. Now, there's some nuances about practice that matters. And one is, it's got to be the right level of difficulty, the right level of challenge. If it's too difficult for their current level of skill, it's frustrating and learning really doesn't happen. If it's too simple for their current level of skill, it's boring and learning doesn't happen. And in between is the zone where it's the level of engagement, and this comes from Csikszentmihalyi's study of flow, but it's also where learning happens, which comes from Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, and they turn out to mesh perfectly. And this illustrates that you have to carefully calibrate the level of challenge of your problems, particularly across problems. As they develop, they need to have more challenge. Yes, Gayatri, this is why audience and profiling is important, and skill calibration, and we may not get it right. So testing it and refining it can matter. So the right level of challenge is one nuance on across your practice activities. Another one is spacing. So we tend to mass our practice either in a one-day workshop or several-day workshop or in an e-learning outfit. And we actually will do pretty well on a test right at the end. But the problem is it dissipates really quickly. I like to joke, this was your college experience, right? Study before the test, pass the test. 3 days later, you may as well not have studied at all. But it turns out if we space out the learning, we might not do quite as well on the test. We'll do quite well, don't get me wrong, but it's there much longer afterwards. And that's really important for the purposes of retention. Remember that goal we had before? So this is what ease. Now, people always wonder how much spacing and, what are the intervals between? And the answer, of course, is it depends. It depends on how complex it is and how frequently they perform it after learning experience, as I've already mentioned, and how important it is if they get it wrong. If it's really important, pilots practice for situations they hope never to face. And yet if they do, it's really important. So they do a lot of practice because their responses, performance support can't solve it in those instances. So they have to be ready to deal with it. By the way, reactivating over time matters. That's why we do coaching after a learning event, or we can use technology to deliver reactivation opportunities, or we can stream out more practice problems and reflection opportunities and evaluation for impact to assessors. And that leads to really high levels of ability to continue perform when it matters. But we have to understand this and design for the retention we need to achieve. Also, and that's retention, but talking about transfer, there's a lot of possible applications of anything we might teach, say negotiation. And then there's the correct applications. For instance, you're not supposed to negotiate with your kids. We do, but we shouldn't. So what we want to do is get people to be doing the appropriate applications and not doing the inappropriate ones. Now, if our target is A, we need people to, in this case, negotiate with a government inspector. But we've only been training on negotiation with vendors, the O's, the blue O's there, we're unlikely to transfer to A. But if we instead provide our practice opportunities in different contexts, such as dealing with a vendor, dealing with a government official, dealing with some other character. I'm drawing a blank on the other roles right now, sorry. We're much more likely to transfer to A than if we only had done dealing with vendors, the blue circles. And that's important for making sure we generalize appropriately and transfer to all the appropriate situations that we have. So this is what generates transfer. And we do need concrete context. Those are better. And we may need facilitation to abstract and reflect across those opportunities. So how should you respond to a training request? You don't say no, but you do. So you say yes, but you say yes and then you go in and ask and start talking. Now, you may know the green, the second triangle there. When you have a problem that you're trying to solve and you come up, for instance, how do I meet this need to do training on X? You want to diverge first on all the different possibilities you might consider, and then you converge, and that's why it's a diamond. You go out and then back. But you should do that in the analysis up front as well. And this, as was indicated in some of the chat, can be challenging because you have to work with your business partner on this, not just take their PowerPoints, PDFs, but say, wait, let's explore the possible sources of this problem. And let's make sure we're solving the right problem before we then diverge and figure out solutions and then converge on what we're going to actually develop. And yes, Gayatri, this is iterative. The whole point is to make sure, check and make sure we're doing the right analysis. And this requires doing performance consulting up front, going back to what I was talking about, identifying the performance gap and finding the root cause, and being clear about what it is we need to address before you then go in and design the solution. So we explore possible performance gaps and root causes. When somebody comes to you and says, we need a course on sales, you can say, well, what's the problem? Is it too long to close a deal? Is the rate of closure not appropriate? What is the root performance gap we have? And then what's the cause of that? Are people just not using the system? Are they forgetting to enter stuff? Are they not doing the appropriate follow-throughs at the right times? Let's go find out what the gap in behavior is that we need them to do differently. Then we can design a solution. So it's not no, it's yes, and let's dig in. Not everybody's going to go for this. This is, I acknowledge that. But we want to keep pushing more and more for this and find those eager adopters that do understand this and get this and want to solve real problems. And those will be the people you should work with. Okay, we've designed for an impact. How do we know we've had it? How do we know? We've analyzed the problem. We've designed a solution. Have we solved it? How do we know? He says, pausing. Looking at their behavior, absolutely. Ideally, and in fact, on principle, there should be an observable change in their behavior. And so we want to look at their behavior, but in particular, we'd like to look at it in a specific way. But yes, Teresa, we want to see if their behaviors change from before our intervention to afterwards. New and higher level of performance. Exactly, Herman. How do we know that we've got a new and higher level of performance? Review the delta in performance in context, Becky. Absolutely. We look to see, has that behavior changed? Has learning transfer taken place? Have they retained it and are they transferring it? There's a key word, Gayatri, measurement. You have a strategy about it, but really what we need to do is we need to measure. And the measurements aren't ones necessarily that we have access to on our own. We have to work with partners. So ideally, somebody comes and says, we have a problem with sales. And the very first step should be to identify what is the performance gap and what is the root cause. So identify what is the business impact. And then we work backwards and we say, what would we be doing differently that would change that? What should the employees in the workplace be doing differently to change that? Should they be, the problem is too many errors in manufacturing. How do we reduce that? The problem is we're not making enough sales. What would it take people be doing differently to change that? So we identify the change in the workplace, and then we say, what is it then that we need people to be able to do that they can't do now? Solution could be putting information ahead, having them acquire new skills. We're talking a lot these days about skilling and identifying new things we need people to know. We need to make sure that, but many times the solution, I think it was Joe Harless who famously said, inside every bloated training course is this lean job aid struggling to get out. There may be times when performance support is a better solution, but whatever it is, once we know what we need people to do differently, then we can have a clear performance objective that we can design to address and check to see if that's happening. We can also see what people think of it. That doesn't necessarily impact its effectiveness, but ideally, if it is impacting the effectiveness, we'd like them to have a level of appropriate engagement. We don't want them to think this is onerous. We don't want them to think this is horribly boring and uninteresting. We'd like them to be emotionally engaged as well as cognitively. And we have evidence about conation, so if they're motivated to learn, it's much more effective. So we do want that for learning experience design. And if we're selling it, for any reason, way, shape, or form, we should be concerned about the experience as well. And this is just what we talked about earlier. Better rating surveys as user acceptance, higher scores as demonstrating their ability at the end of the learning intervention, seeing the persistent change in the behavior in the workplace would be the ideal outcome. And then it impacting the actual metrics in the organization is where we should be going. Now look, part of the deliverable package, yes, Gayatri. Ideally, you would have in agreements that evaluation is part of the package. Look, not everybody's going to be ready to make a change. Particularly, nobody expects you to change everything to that whole picture at the end. In fact, I recently was on a webinar where somebody said, so and so has in their entire career has only ever done 2 level 4s, and that's changing. That's perhaps sad, but not unrealistic. Question: wherever you are, and we took that poll before, take the next step, and not on all your courses. Figure out some. You want to be strategic. Gayatri mentioned a measurement strategy. Yeah, what you want to do is figure out where, if I collect this additional data, find somebody who will do that with me, and I know it's going to have an impact, positive impact that I can promote. What you want to do is find those wins early that will give you the leverage to start expanding your ability to do more impactful learning over time. We don't expect you to go all the way, but start making the next step on your path to getting there. So, in summary, analysis up front. You can't have an impact if you don't know what you need to improve. So you need to analysis to identify that performance gap and the root cause, so you know that this is something my approach will be able to change. If it's something your approach can impact, that's not an opportunity for you to approach it, but you, with performance support or training or both together, which is not unknown. In fact, it's probably more common than we think. Make sure you know what you have to impact. Then you can design to achieve that impact. And that includes contextualized and spaced out practice, the right level of difficulty, the right choice of examples. Make sure you're aligning, and there's more. There's the right models and to guide performance and use as a basis to provide feedback. There are nuances around all of this, but this is the big picture. And then evaluate. And there's 2 forms of evaluation that matter. Formative says you design your first intervention and in fact prototype the key practice first and test that to see if it works and is impactful, and then you work around that. That's David Merrill's Pebbles in a Pond, working from first principles of instruction. Test it, see if it's having the impact needed, refine it if it's not, and then when it is having the impact you need, document that. You have summative evaluation that you can carry forward and say to your stakeholders and your funders, look, when we find the right problem, design an intervention for a solution, we can solve it and achieve this benefit. And as was mentioned in the chat, get the ROI, show that the cost of fixing it is less than the cost it was of the problem itself, and show the improvement. That's what will lead you to design for impact. And at that point, I want to turn it over to Isha to have another poll. We asked where you were. Now, where do you want to be? And Isha's put up the poll. Thank you. And where you want to be isn't necessarily, everybody might be at calculating ROI, but what's the right next step for you? Where do you want to be as your next step? And let's see.
I think for a couple of seconds more.
Well, yeah, we're getting close to, they're still voting. No, they're not.
Right. Let me just share the results.
Well, you notice we've moved up quite a bit from where we were at the initial poll. At the initial poll, there were a lot of people at 1 and 2. Now we see nobody at 1, very few people at 2. People are talking 3, 4, and 5. That's a good aspiration. Don't try and do too much up front, but this is the impact opportunity we have to move forward in what we're doing. And it's not easy. I'm not claiming this is magic or whatever, But when you have an understanding of where you want to go, you have a much better chance of getting there. And hopefully what we've done is try and show you how to get there. At this point, we can remove the poll, and we have left time for questions, comments, issues. Feel free to throw them in the chat. Gayatri mentions that there's challenges. There were a couple questions that came up sort of prior to this from a previous instance of this talk. What happens when the client isn't a direct connection? And that seems related to some of the questions that are rising in the chat as well. It can be challenging. You need to find those early adopters, those people who are willing to work with you and share their data to solve their problem. You need to have a clear focus on solving their problem, but help them understand that just giving you PowerPoints and PDFs isn't necessarily going to solve it. There's a lot of chance it won't. Telling ain't training. Too often our industry has been mistakenly focused on thinking that if we give people information, it will change their behavior. There's probably a lot of reasons behind this, but that's not necessarily what's going to happen. And so you need to find people, help them understand that you really need to work with them, and find the people who will want to get and have an impact and work with them. And when you succeed at having those, use those to evangelize for more. It's a small, slow process, but you have to be persistent and patient. And how do you do evaluation quickly when you have a small team was another question that came up. Levette, as far as I know, the answer is no, it's not eligible for SHRM credits, I'm afraid. Sad to say, we haven't worked with them to try and arrange that that's qualified. Something to keep in mind for the future. So another question that arose when we did this before was, how do you quickly do this with a small team? How do you gather this data in situations? You need access to the people. Have a performance assessment at the end, make your final practice, which should be designed right after you've done your analysis. The first thing you should develop is the final practice, and prototype it and test it. And that's your level 2 data. And then you can ideally, you can ask people, is that change in the workplace happening? You need to do that sometime afterwards, but you can just send out a quick survey. Ideally, you can send it to their supervisors and their coworkers as well. But if the worst case, you can at least just ask the people, but you can try and ask better questions. In Will Tollimer's book, which used to be titled Performance Focused Smile Sheets, and he has a more apt name now, you can ask smart questions that try and evaluate it. Ideally, you collect real data from the business that says this behavior has changed. It might be something you can instrument with XAPI to track data in systems they're using. You might have a mechanism where their supervisors are evaluating them. You might have some customer data. And ultimately, you'd like to have the final data. But those forms of data come from other people than you, and you will have to work with them to collect it. I hope that helps. Any other questions? I'm seeing if any other questions are emerging in the chat. I thank you for the kind words, by the way. Really, it's your chance. You've got 7 more minutes or so for free consulting. And any comments or questions? Oh, and she does have a survey that she's asking you to fill out. Well, that's very nice of you to say. Kaylisa? I hope I pronounced that correctly. And thank you all for your attention and participation. I greatly appreciate it. Can I quickly show my slides again? done? Probably not really. There's 60 slides to go through in 7 minutes. That would be pretty tough. Any particular one you want to see, Cindy? We can do that much easier than we can go through the entire deck. What do you do when you have issues with buy-in for training initiatives? We recently implemented an LMS and are having issues with department leaders prioritizing training. They have to, we are sort of in a self-imposed conundrum that our training has been, compliance and information dumps, and they haven't led to any changes. So getting them to believe that investing in training may be an uphill battle, but I think what we need to do is show that we are focused on impact and convince them. And again, start with the ones who hear the message earlier. No worries, thank you, Gayatri. But it's a long-term game, Christina, that you really have to, one of the things I say is it's easier to get forgiveness and permission. So start focusing on better impact, just writing better multiple choice questions that are actual applications. You may have to infer what those are, but try and do the right thing for them while you're having this argument that they should let you work harder to do good for them. That's what you're offering. And it's just that they have to increasingly be a part of that process. So not just to do it. And yes, there's a barrier that SMEs think they know what is needed. And the evidence is, by the way, that only 70% of what experts do they have conscious access to. They literally can't tell you what they do, but they can tell you what they know. So helping them recognize that what they do isn't what they tell people is a way to help break through that barrier. They should respect your expertise just as you respect their expertise. And that's something that came from John Alexon's book on Mind Meld, which was about his PhD research on how instructional designers can work with SMEs. That was from the higher ed sector, but it applies to what we do as well. So I hope that helps. Carrie says, I'm heading a new training department. We're starting an onboarding training program for service mechanics and admin staff. What metrics do you propose we start measuring? Well, the first thing I'd measure is what is their initial knowledge? Do they have any knowledge of service mechanics, or are these complete interns? But then you also, service mechanics and admin staff. Well, the service mechanics presumably are fixing things. So you want to see what are the metrics of repair and what's the time to proficiency. Admin staff are probably doing more soft skill tasks. So I might be assessing their ability to correctly execute their tasks. So again, this is working with the people who employ the service mechanics and the admin staff and saying what matters to them. You want to have that dialogue and say, when they come out of the training, what are the things they're still doing wrong? That's what you should be focusing on measuring. And how do you know that's the case? And looking for their data of what they want as an outcome of the onboarding. Too often onboarding is, the history of the company. That may or may not matter depending on if it has an influence on the culture. I hope that helps. Other than Sylvie asks, other than the price of hiring new people, what ROI do you calculate in governmental healthcare learning? Depends on the government. Is that, a region in your region in the US? But you should, again, be targeting some change in governmental healthcare that you need to improve. Is it the care of patients? Is it errors? Is it whatever? And then when you have done that, then you calculate what did it cost you to develop it versus what is the cost of the problem. In fact, you really should be determining beforehand, what is the cost of the problem? What is the cost it's going to take to figure out, do a back of the envelope calculation, determine whether that's one of the priority things to determine, should we invest in this training at all? To find out. So Gayatri, show them the WIFM, yeah, what's in it for me. So thank you all. I notice we're just seconds, we're at the top of the hour. Thank you all for your attention and your time. As Isha says, if you contact us, if you want to talk further, do follow up with the survey, and have a great evening, afternoon, morning, whatever is the rest of your day.
Thank you everyone for joining us today, and thank you, Clark and Sonal, for
Thank
this
you.
wonderful session.
Bye, everyone.
Bye everyone. Take care.